All right, let's jump into this fascinating discussion about rethinking the dating of Paul's epistles. It's really intriguing how traditional dating places these letters around 50 to 60 CE, but there's an emerging theory suggesting a 2nd century origin.
That's quite a shift, right? Exactly. It's like turning the whole historical narrative on its head. So, what's the main thrust behind the traditional dating?
Traditionally, scholars have looked at internal clues in the letters, references to early church disputes over Jewish law, sexual ethics, and eschatological beliefs. The idea was that these issues, combined with mentions of figures like Peter and James, anchor Paul in the first century.
Yep. And that's further bolstered by early citations like those found in Wers Clement and Ignatius of Antioch, which assume Paul's ideas were circulating already by the end of the first century, correct?
Exactly. Those early citations have been seen as evidence that Paul's theological framework was already established early on. But here's where things get interesting. The revisionist perspective challenges this timeline, arguing that the style and themes in these letters, such as an emphasis on grace over law and a cosmic dualism, are much more in line with 2nd century Christian thought.
I see what you mean. So, basically, the revisionists are saying that the internal content of the letters just doesn't quite match with a mid-first century context. It sounds like a significant paradigmatic shift.
Yep. They point out that the emphasis on internalized faith, the almost otherworldly Christology, and the devaluation of Jewish ritual practices seem to reflect later, more developed theological debates. It's almost as if the theological language is anticipating the later squabbles of the 2nd century.
Right, that's pretty compelling. And then there's Marcion of Sinope, who, if I understand correctly, plays a key role here. He supposedly crafted a canon that included a version of Luke and 10 Pauline epistles, emphasizing grace and completely rejecting the Old Testament.
Absolutely. Marcion is a huge piece of this puzzle. Revisionists argue that not only did Marcion preserve Paul's writings, but he might have actually had a role in editing or even composing them to fit his own theological agenda. It's like they were reworked to suit the needs of a later, more reflective church environment in the 2nd century.
That does raise some eyebrows, doesn't it? It certainly does. And if Marcion was actively shaping this corpus, wouldn't that imply that the texts were circulating in some form much later than traditionally thought?
Exactly. Revisionists note that if these texts were widely accepted in the 1st century, they'd likely appear more prominently in other early Christian writings. But their conspicuous absence until Marcion's canon suggests they might have been more of a later development.
Yeah, that's an interesting inconsistency. Now let's talk a bit about the textual clues. How does the linguistic style support a 2nd century origin?
Well, so the Greek used in these epistles is often quite refined and reflects the sort of Hellenistic rhetoric you'd expect from a later period. It's like there's an advanced, almost sophisticated narrative framework that seems to be more in line with the literary trends of the 2nd century than what we'd expect from mid-1st century documents.
I get it. And I guess the way they reference traditions and apostolic authority within these texts hints at a broader debate already underway among early Christians, right?
Exactly. That's a key point. The mentions of tradition and apostolic legitimacy suggest that the authors were engaged in an ongoing theological debate. It implies that there was already a shifting landscape of ideas, which aligns neatly with the contested environment of the 2nd century.
Right, that makes sense. However, don't you think that some of these points might be a bit of overinterpretation? I mean, could it be just that later editors refined Paul's thought rather than actually redating the epistles?
That's a good challenge, and honestly, it's one of the main critiques of the revisionist view. There's a possibility that later redaction could account for the refined style, but the revisionists counter this by pointing to the sharp theological dichotomies, flesh versus spirit, law versus grace, which mirror the polemics of the 2nd century factions much more strongly than the early Jewish debates.
So you're saying the content itself is too advanced for the earlier period? Right, but here's a twist. If Paul were a historical figure from the 1st century, wouldn't his personal context be more evident in his letters? Instead, we see a very abstract, almost cosmological emphasis on Christ that anticipates Gnostic ideas emerging later on.
Precisely, exactly. This abstract Christology and the mystical union described in the epistles are a bit out of step with the historical messianic expectations of early Judaism. It's like the texts are reimagining what it means to be in Christ for a later period of doctrinal formation.
Yeah, that's really intriguing. And then we have Acts of the Apostles, which is often relied upon to corroborate Paul's early history, but itself seems to have been composed later, possibly as a response to the same theological trends.
Absolutely. Acts is believed to have been written somewhere around 90-110 CE or later, and it paints Paul in a rather sanitized, almost orthodox light, which often contradicts the raw intensity of the letters. If we consider Acts as a response to a Marcion-influenced Paul, that's another tick in the 2nd century hypothesis.
I see the point here. Now, isn't it a bit bold to suggest that Paul may have been a literary construct or a theological mouthpiece rather than a historic figure? I mean, that's a radical departure from centuries of scholarship.
It is bold, but it's not without merit. The idea is that perhaps instead of being a singular historical figure, Paul represents a composite voice, a vehicle through which emerging theological debates, especially around grace and the rejection of the law, were expressed. It's almost as if the figure of Paul was retroactively shaped to meet new doctrinal needs in the radical theological climate of the 2nd century.
Yeah, it's definitely a provocative idea. And it would explain why certain themes in the epistles seem so discordant with the immediate post-Christ context. You have this almost paradoxical blend of Jewish roots and radical new interpretations that make more sense, according to these revisionists, in a later period.
Exactly. It's like trying to mix two different recipes, one from the old world and another from an entirely new culinary tradition. The end product might just reflect the spice of the later era rather than the simplicity of the original ingredient.
That's a great analogy. But then, critically speaking, how do we approach the value of these epistles if we say accept a 2nd century origin? Does that diminish their theological impact?
Not at all. Even if the epistles were crafted in the 2nd century, their value as theological texts remains profound. It's more about understanding the context in which they were produced, seeing them less as historical correspondence and more as expressions of a living, evolving faith.
So, in a way, this reinterpretation allows us to appreciate the documents for what they contribute to Christian thought, rather than strictly as historical artifacts.
Exactly. It reframes the idea of Paul from being merely a missionary figure to a symbol of a dynamic and contested theological evolution. It's like looking at art from a different era. It doesn't make it any less beautiful or influential.
I totally get that. And with such critical re-examinations, do you think this might lead to other adjustments in early Christian historiography?
Absolutely. It opens the door to reconsidering a lot of what we've taken for granted in early Christian history. If we accept that Paul's epistles could be a product of 2nd century debate, it forces us to re-examine other texts, documents, and even the way we construct early church history.
Right, yeah. I can see how this argument, while not universally accepted, injects fresh life into the debates about early Christianity. It reminds us that historical texts often have lives and voices that evolve over time rather than remaining fixed.
Exactly, and there's beauty in that ambiguity. The texts remain central to Christian thought, but their origins become a rich tapestry of evolving ideas rather than a strictly linear historical account.
That's a refreshing perspective. But playing devil's advocate for a moment, isn't there a risk that this kind of redating might undermine the reliability of other historical markers we rely on from those early decades?
That's a valid critique. One could argue that by redating Paul's epistles, we might be forced to recontextualize a host of other historical documents. However, Even traditional scholars accept that texts are products of their time. The revisionists contend that rather than being errors, these shifts in chronology help us understand the transformative nature of early Christian theology.
So, it's less about undermining historical reliability and more about embracing the complexity and fluidity of early Christian discourse?
Yes, exactly. It's about recognizing that these texts were written in response to vibrant, ongoing debates, and that their evolution reflects the dynamic struggles of a faith in formation.
Yeah, that definitely adds depth to our understanding. To wrap this up, it's fascinating how rethinking the dating of Paul's epistles not only challenges traditional timelines, but illuminates the rich and sometimes chaotic landscape of early Christian theology.
Absolutely. It's like peeling back layers of history and theology. Whether or not you buy the 2nd-century origin theory, it undeniably forces us to re-examine the interplay between tradition, textual evidence, and theological evolution.
Indeed. And that's the beauty of historical debate. It never really ends, does it? There's always another facet to uncover, another perspective to consider.
Right. Always more to learn, more to explore. Thanks for diving into this with me. It's been a truly enriching conversation.
Absolutely. It's been great.